In episode 119, titled Conditional Access and Geofencing, Policy Decisions that Reduce Credential Risk, we frame conditional access as rules based on context and risk, because the exam expects you to move beyond static passwords and treat authentication as an adaptive decision. Credential theft is common, but stolen credentials do not always come with the same device, the same location, or the same behavior pattern as the legitimate user, and conditional access takes advantage of that gap. The goal is to reduce credential risk by making authentication stronger when conditions look risky, and by restricting access when the context violates policy, without turning every login into a frustrating obstacle. Geofencing fits into this model as one signal that can reduce exposure, but it works best when it is combined with identity strength and device trust rather than treated as a standalone gate. When you can explain conditional access as a risk-based policy engine, you are aligned with the exam's emphasis on layered identity controls rather than single controls. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Conditional access evaluates conditions such as location, device compliance, time, and behavior, then applies a policy decision such as allow, block, or require stronger verification. Location signals include where the sign-in appears to originate, which can indicate travel, remote access patterns, or unusual source regions. Device compliance signals include whether the device is managed, patched, and has required security agents, because compromised or unmanaged devices increase the probability that a valid login is not actually legitimate. Time conditions can restrict access to expected windows or can raise requirements outside normal patterns, because many attacks occur off hours when detection and response may be slower. Behavior signals include anomalies like repeated failed logins, abnormal access to unfamiliar applications, and other patterns that diverge from user baseline, because attackers often behave differently even when they have valid credentials. The exam typically expects you to recognize that these conditions are combined to produce a risk judgment, and that the policy action depends on how sensitive the target resource is. When you describe conditions in plain terms and connect them to policy outcomes, you demonstrate practical control, understanding, rather than memorization. Geofencing is one signal among many because geography is a coarse attribute that can be helpful for reducing noise but is not strong enough to prove legitimacy by itself. Geographic signals can reduce exposure when a service should never be accessed from certain regions, and it can also create high-confidence anomalies like impossible travel when a user appears to sign in from distant locations within a short time window. The limitation is that attackers can use virtual private networks, proxies, and compromised hosts in allowed regions, so geofencing can be bypassed and therefore should not replace stronger controls. The exam expects you to treat geofencing as complementary, where it helps flag suspicious context and reduce background noise. But multi-factor authentication and device trust remain the primary barriers against credential misuse. When you place geofencing in the signal and guardrail category rather than the proof category, you avoid over-reliance and design more resilient policy. This is also why geofencing decisions should be tested carefully, because coarse filters can block legitimate traveling users and create self-inflicted access issues. Requiring stronger verification for risky contexts and new devices is a core conditional access pattern because it preserves usability for low-risk access while increasing assurance when risk rises. Risky contexts include sign-ins from unfamiliar regions, unmanaged devices, unusual times, and abnormal behavior patterns. And the appropriate response is often to require a stronger method, such as phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication or a verified device posture check. New devices are especially important because attackers often authenticate from devices that are not registered or known to the organization. So, treating new device sign-ins as higher risk is a practical way to stop many credential reuse and spraying successes. The exam often calls this step-up behavior, where the policy does not always block, but it increases assurance requirements when signals suggest elevated risk. This approach also supports adoption because users experience fewer interruptions during normal work while still facing strong gates during unusual events. When you can describe step up as a risk response rather than as a blanket prompt, you show the adaptive reasoning the exam expects. Step-up authentication and session controls matter for sensitive actions because the highest risk moment is often not the initial login, but the moment a user attempts a privileged operation or accesses high-value data. Step-up authentication means requiring re-verification when a sensitive action is requested, such as accessing an administrative portal, changing identity settings, or exporting large data sets, because an attacker may hijack an existing session or gain partial access and then attempt escalation. Session controls can limit how long sessions remain valid, restrict token reuse, and enforce re-authentication when context changes, such as a sudden change in location or device posture. These controls reduce the damage window because even if an attacker gains initial access, they face additional barriers before performing the actions that cause the most harm. The exam expects you to connect conditional access to session management because identity risk is not a single moment, it is a continuous concern over the lifespan of a session. When you treat sensitive actions as requiring extra assurance, you align access decisions to risk rather than applying the same rule to everything. Consider a scenario where the system blocks a sign-in due to impossible travel or an unfamiliar region, because this is a common example that tests your ability to connect context signals to policy actions. A user successfully signs in from one region, and shortly afterward, a sign-in attempt appears from a distant region that is not physically plausible in that time frame, suggesting compromised credentials being used elsewhere. The conditional access policy evaluates this as high risk and blocks the attempt, or it requires strong step-up verification combined with device compliance, depending on the organization's policy. Blocking is often appropriate when confidence in compromise is high, but step up can be appropriate when legitimate travel patterns exist and the organization wants a safe verification path that does not create unnecessary lockouts. Logging and alerting should accompany the decision so responders can investigate whether the account is compromised, reset sessions, and verify user activity. The exam expects you to recognize that impossible travel is a strong risk signal, but it must still be handled with an operational plan to avoid harming legitimate users. When you describe both the decision and the follow-up, you show mature control thinking. A pitfall is making rules too strict, causing lockouts and support overload, because overly aggressive conditional access can disrupt normal work and create emergency exception pressure. If users frequently travel, connect from mobile networks with shifting geolocation, or work outside standard hours, strict geofencing and rigid time windows can generate false positives and prevent legitimate access. Support overload then leads to policy weakening, such as disabling conditions or adding broad exceptions, which can reduce security below the original baseline. The exam expects you to recognize that strictness must be tuned to reality and that gradual rollout with monitoring is safer than immediate hard enforcement. Policies should include safe paths for legitimate exceptions, such as trusted virtual private network access, managed device requirements, or step-up verification rather than blanket blocks. When strictness is engineered for usability, conditional access becomes sustainable and effective rather than brittle and unpopular. Another pitfall is making rules too loose and gaining a false sense of security, because conditional access that rarely challenges or blocks does not meaningfully reduce credential risk. Overly permissive policies may allow unmanaged devices, may not require multi-factor authentication for sensitive applications, and may ignore strong anomaly signals, leaving stolen credentials largely usable. Loose policies can also be undermined by broad exception groups that grow over time, where more and more users are exempted for convenience until the policy applies to almost nobody. The exam often tests this by presenting a policy that sounds present but has weak enforcement, and the correct analysis is that a control that never triggers is not providing risk reduction. Balancing usability does not mean avoiding enforcement. It means focusing enforcement where risk is high and where the organization can support the user experience. When you keep enforcement meaningful, conditional access becomes a real barrier against credential misuse rather than a checkbox. Quick wins include starting with monitoring and then enforcing gradually, because conditional access decisions depend on understanding normal patterns and because abrupt enforcement can create broad disruption. Monitoring mode allows you to see how often conditions would have triggered, which users would be impacted, and which signals produce the most false positives, giving you data to tune policy before blocking access. Gradual enforcement can begin with high-risk targets such as administrative portals and remote access entry points, where stronger requirements are most defensible and where misuse has the highest impact. This phased approach also helps improve communications, training, and exception handling workflows because early deployment reveals what users actually experience. The exam tends to reward this rollout strategy because it demonstrates operational maturity and recognizes that identity controls must be adopted, not forced through constant lockouts. When you phase in enforcement, you preserve security goals while avoiding the backlash that leads to weak exceptions. Operationally, documenting exceptions and revalidating frequently is critical because exceptions are how conditional access quietly erodes over time if not governed. Exceptions should be time-limited and justified by business need, with clear ownership, because unbounded exceptions become permanent bypass paths that attackers can exploit. Revalidation ensures that the reason for the exception still exists and that the user or system still meets any compensating controls, such as managed device requirements or restricted access scope. Frequent review also helps detect drift, where users accumulate exemptions through role changes and where the exception list becomes too large to manage safely. The exam expects you to recognize exception governance as part of identity security because the strongest policy is ineffective if many accounts are exempt. When exceptions are controlled and reviewed, conditional access remains aligned to risk rather than to historical convenience. A memory anchor that fits conditional access is context, risk, require, restrict, review, because it captures the decision lifecycle in a way that is easy to apply to exam scenarios. Context is the set of signals like location, device compliance, time, and behavior that inform the decision. Risk is the interpretation of those signals, where unusual context increases suspicion and changes the required assurance level. Require refers to step-up authentication and stronger verification methods for risky situations and sensitive resources. Restrict refers to blocking or limiting sessions when the risk is too high or when policy is violated, such as impossible travel or non-compliant devices accessing privileged apps. Review refers to the ongoing governance of exceptions, rule performance, and false positives, so the policy remains effective and usable. This anchor helps you draft and evaluate policies quickly, which is exactly what the exam often asks you to do. A practical prompt exercise is drafting a conditional access policy for an administrative portal, because admin access is a high-impact scenario that benefits from strong context-based rules. A strong policy would require phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, require managed and compliant devices, and restrict access to approved regions or to access through a trusted virtual private network, depending on operational needs. It would also apply step-up verification for sensitive actions within the portal, such as changing identity settings, and enforce short session lifetimes to reduce the damage window if a session is hijacked. Logging and alerting would be mandatory, with alerts on denied attempts, impossible travel signals, and repeated failures, because admin access anomalies require rapid investigation. Exceptions would be rare, time-limited, and documented, with break-glass procedures separated and monitored carefully. The exam expects you to include both the decision signals and the governance elements, because identity controls are only as strong as their exception handling and monitoring. As a recap prompt, geofencing complements multi-factor authentication by reducing exposure and adding a risk signal, while multi-factor authentication provides the primary barrier that makes stolen passwords insufficient. Geofencing can block or challenge sign-ins from regions that should not be used, reducing scanning and credential abuse noise, and it can surface anomalies like impossible travel that indicate credential theft. Multi-factor authentication ensures that even if a password is stolen, the attacker still needs a second proof, and conditional access uses geofencing to decide when to require stronger factors or when to block entirely. Together, they form a layered identity defense where geography shapes risk decisions and multi-factor authentication provides strong verification. The exam often rewards this combined framing because it shows you understand both controls as complementary rather than competing. When you explain it this way, you avoid over-reliance on geo rules while still acknowledging their value. Episode 119 concludes with the idea that conditional access reduces credential risk by making access decisions based on context and risk, using signals like location, device compliance, time, and behavior to decide when to allow, block, or require stronger verification. Geofencing is useful as a core signal and guardrail, but it must be combined with multi-factor authentication, device trust, and monitoring, because it can be bypassed and can block legitimate users unexpectedly. The main pitfalls are policies that are too strict and create lockouts, and policies that are too loose and create false confidence, and both are avoided through monitor-first rollout, gradual enforcement, and disciplined exception governance. The policy drafting rehearsal assignment is to take a high-risk target like an admin portal, write a policy that defines required signals and step-up conditions, define how exceptions are handled and reviewed, and narrate what logs and alerts confirm the policy is working. When you can narrate that policy clearly, you demonstrate exam-ready judgment and the practical understanding needed to use conditional access as a sustainable risk reducer. With that mindset, conditional access becomes a precise tool that limits the usefulness of stolen credentials without stopping business. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.